Great content so far. A pleasure to be here for a first event. Not my first event. But yeah, so what are we going to talk about after some very good theoretical discussions? We'll take a different approach and talk to an application issue that I'd like to refer to as the disclosure dilemma, and how we can start recognizing what that means and then proceed to enable better defensive outcomes. I don't know what the best place for me to be is, but I'm going to try right here for the time being and then wander around. So, okay, now I am settled in, let's go. So who am I? My name is Joe Slowik. I currently, the agenda, a long story about what my affiliation is listed in the agenda. That's my own company, but that's a separate story. But my primary role is I work for the MITRE Corporation now since January, and I lead the attack, the CTI function within MITRE ATT&CK. So something that's come up in several presentations already. If you have questions about MITRE ATT&CK, I'm more than happy to answer and enjoy talking about that, as well as doing some critical infrastructure security research. Previously, I've had various roles in threat intel, detection engineering, and threat hunting, as well as doing some threat intelligence training, teaching, and advisory work. But enough about me. What is the disclosure dilemma? That will be our first agenda item, and then we'll talk about CTI and how that relates to a fundamental intelligence dilemma that governs how we should disseminate and act upon information that we come across and develop over time. We'll then go through some examples, and then based upon that, we'll talk about balancing a gain-loss proposition when it comes to not just developing intelligence, but actually using it and applying intelligence to improve organizational outcomes while maintaining our ability to get visibility into threat actors and their operations. Okay, the disclosure dilemma. What are we talking about here? Well, first, what is a dilemma? A dilemma is, as the Oxford English Dictionary would have us learn, a situation in which a difficult choice has to be made between two or more alternatives, especially ones that are equally undesirable. So it's a hard choice between options, that there are either mutually bad or mutually good reasons for going with either option at play, or maybe there are multiple options, and thus we have to try to come up with some criteria to decide which is the best option for the circumstances that I find myself in. And we can visualize this in meme format with the two-button meme of, do I do option A or option B, when maybe they both have certain shortcomings to them, or there are consequences as a result of going with either option and figuring out which is the, again, either most desirable or least desirable item that we want to avoid. Well, what does this look like in intelligence? Well, the thing is, and this is something for those who have done any sort of training with me or lots of times where I'm speaking, intelligence is fundamentally decision support. At the end of the day, intelligence is only as functional as to the extent that we could actually engage and inform some decision maker, whether we're talking a CISO to your tier 1 SOC analyst in an information-starved environment. How can they make better choices or make better decisions? As a result, those decisions have consequences and impacts, whether it's determining how my organization's fundamental security posture will look at a strategic level, all the way down to, do I block an alert on this IP address that popped up in my proxy logs? As a result, intelligence needs to understand these outcomes and what they mean for our ability to process intelligence. Because the thing is, it's not just about our understanding of what adversaries are doing and operating in sort of a vacuum, but rather we need to understand that the adversary gets a vote. We are working in a dynamic landscape in which the opposing party, whoever is trying to get into our network, extract value from our organization, or engage in some disruptive operation, they are operating along with us through this engagement. And as a result, any action we take can be or will be noticed by them and allow that adversary to respond. Which gets us into the discussion of intelligence equities. What are the items of value within the intelligence process that we need to be aware of? So there's first and foremost sources. We need to get our information from somewhere. This could be a mixture of public sources that everyone is kind of aware of, or the outputs of someone else's threat intelligence research. But more importantly, we have private and other sources that may not be obviously available and that adversaries might not know about, that we may disclose as the result of a entity that we're supporting making a decision. Furthermore, there is the methodology around how we interact with sources, how information is collected, as well as whether those methods are proprietary, secret, or even in some cases public. We map to the diamond model, but we do that in the sense that we are collecting information from this particular set of telemetry that you would only learn about if you read your end user licensing agreement in a very, very, very tiny print or whatever at the end that lets you know that, oh, actually every binary that runs in your system gets sent to our cloud and we're analyzing it, or something along those lines. And finally, there's the analytical portion of piecing these items together. Sources plus methods leads to some conclusion. This could be in the form that eventually comes out in a public blog, or it could be a private item only within the organization you're supporting, or behind a paywall because you're a subscription service or some point. But the end result of all of this. The thing is that ideally, sources and methods, as well as the analysis that comes out of them, are not obvious or known to adversaries, that we want to keep them in the dark with what we know about them. Otherwise, what would any savvy adversary do? They will change how they operate. They will migrate to areas that we don't have visibility in or that we don't have understanding of. But the thing is that for intelligence to matter, it needs to lead to decisions that have an impact for the supported organization. And that puts us in a little bit of a bind, because impactful intelligence cannot be easily hidden if it leads to an action. If I'm letting my SOC know that this is the bad campaign that's emerging right now based upon information I derived from, say, a trust group or sharing group, and now we're responding to that, if the adversary tries to get into our environment and they aren't unable to because we've taken some preparatory action, they're going to notice that and wonder, why did this not work? Why was I caught right away? And it's this impact scenario that provides adversaries with insight into what intelligence knows about their own operation. They have a leak, they have been found out, someone has analyzed their tools and understands how they function. And thus adversaries can determine what may have informed defenders and operate to change that so that they don't get caught again or that they're able to succeed in other environments, migrating away from what we understand and know about them to do something malicious in a way that we no longer can observe. Thus giving us our intelligence dilemma, that we have some intelligence finding, we've learned something about the adversary that can be very useful for our audience. Do we disclose that information to our stakeholders, allowing them to take some sort of action with the possibility then that adversaries learn of this and modify their operations? Or do we withhold that finding to preserve our sources and methods and ability to track this adversary? That may sound like, why would you not inform someone that something bad is going on? Well, we're at TLP clear. If we were at TLP red right now, and if we had other handling and dissemination requirements in play, I would be telling you lots of information that you shouldn't be acting on with breaking TLP and such. And the reason is that we want to preserve our understanding and ability to track adversaries and not necessarily disclose at an early or an immature time. Thus highlighting that we are actually sitting on information quite frequently that may be of use to some party, but we don't disclose it because we have evaluated this dilemma that withholding that information from an operational or functional stakeholder is more valuable than disclosing it leading to some action. So how does that apply to CTI more specifically? Since this is a general factor with intelligence as a discipline, but obviously has repercussions for cyber threat intelligence as well. Well, CTI is a technical discipline. You can see Twitter threads and arguments or whatever. It's like, you don't need to be technical to be in CTI. I don't want to hurt anyone's feelings, but if you're not technical, you're going to need to become technical to be in CTI. It's cyber threat intelligence. That's fine, because the reason is that because of that technical aspect that we're dealing with artifacts like network infrastructure, binaries and tooling, adversary operations on host and similar, we need a way of persistently collecting that information in order to be effective as an intelligence organization, a way of getting samples or monitoring telemetry and so forth, and a loss of that collection makes it harder to do our jobs. It may make it impossible to do our jobs if certain information sources go dark or if too much is revealed to stakeholders as a result of our disclosure. So when looking at CTI as a process, we could view CTI as a funnel of sorts, where we begin with raw data that needs to be collected in order to, through continuous collection and analysis, to process it into some enriched information. And this enriched information needs further analysis and understanding in order to come up with decision support for our stakeholders, what adversaries are doing at a certain point in time, how to respond to those adversaries, what detections we need to create, what threat hunting hypotheses we should develop in order to look for these adversaries. But it's at this precise moment where we close the loop on the intelligence cycle by disseminating and integrating that finding into our stakeholders' operations that the adversary can identify that they've been found out. I lost my endpoint that I had compromised. All of a sudden, my C2 channel is gone. Some other action takes place. The adversary has been found out. And it's that which allows the adversary to then move backward, that if they are a competent adversary, they will wonder what happened. Why is this no longer working? And start identifying what the potential touch points may have been that led to their identification and thus defeat in this specific engagement. And this puts us in a position where CTI now becomes endangered in our ability to continuously collect and analyze that given entity. So what does this look like? CTI-informed defensive actions can span the gamut from very specific tactical decision-making to large strategic analysis and understanding, but certainly on a day-to-day basis, we can look to things like blocking an IP, sinkholing a domain, alerting on a specific file, or whether that's by a specific hash or through a signature such as Yara or something similar, or even blocking or filtering certain ports and communications preemptively to deny adversaries certain space to operate in. And the thing is that all of these involve an action that will be noticeable to any adversary that is paying attention. Adversaries execute, or they possess degrees of operational security. Good adversaries possess very good levels of operational security because at the end of the day, adversaries have two objectives. First, to finish their objectives, and second, to not get caught in executing those objectives, whether that's because they want to avoid law enforcement in the first place, they want to continuously operate, or they want you as the victim to not even know that you have been victimized in the first place. Those are the incentives that we're looking at. Now we can ask ourselves, well, this all sounds well and good, Joe. Is this a real issue in CTI operations and support? Is this just a notional discussion? Well, the thing is, it actually has happened, and we can look to some examples of where this has taken place right now. So, for example, about 6 years ago, there was a blog post that had been published by Threat Connect, a song of Ice and Fancy, detailing how APT28, or Fancy Bear, was creating infrastructure and self-signed certificates for a long period of time that analysts had been using to identify newly registered APT28 network infrastructure with great consistency, allowing for preemptive defense and threat tracking, which was great, because APT28 used this methodology for years. And they never thought that someone might have been looking. But the thing is, shortly after that blog was published, all those trends went away. The adversary was paying attention, and thus the ability to identify new domains and new adversary-created certificates in essentially near real time stopped. A defensive gap created as a result of an intelligence disclosure. Okay, so that's one very specific example. But we could also look to more general examples. Everyone likes picking on North Korean threat actors because they're noisy, they're very active. You see lots of content come out around North Korean operations, and if you go back 10 years, a lot of that was because these operations were seen as relatively unsophisticated, they were viewed as being somewhat primitive, but adversaries learn. Through multiple disclosures over time, and we've seen analysis coming from shops like Mandiant and others, have noted that adversaries learn from what gets disclosed about them and have evolved their operations to operate in more complex and stealthier fashion. As a result, we've seen entities like our Lazaruses and our Kinsukis and so forth. While there are still tidbits that are fairly easy to track, we nonetheless have seen a movement towards more advanced behaviors and tooling on the part of these adversaries, including some really interesting supply chain intrusions that have resulted in cryptocurrency theft in many cases, so not very huge impacts unless they were your wallets, I suppose, but some very interesting tradecraft involved. So another issue, the slingshot item. This was reported on by Kaspersky several years ago. Very controversial because it turned out that the Kaspersky slingshot report was actually revealing an ongoing espionage campaign that was used for counterterrorism purposes, tracking ISIS entities in near real time to inform other operations. That's kind of a big deal because Slingshot was associated with an active counterterrorism operation, and that post-disclosure, the entities in question, ISIS, evolved their operations as such to avoid the collection that was enabled by the router implant that Kaspersky had disclosed. So not just an intelligence loss at this point, but the potential for physical harm. So in looking at this, CTI can be viewed as an expensive luxury. How many places can afford to have a dedicated CTI function? Some, but not too many. Thus, there is a pressure to produce, to justify our existence. What have you done for me lately? How does my organization benefit from having CTI? And a failure to produce results in potentially redundancy. You may not have a job, or you may not be able to get the tools or the capabilities that you need to do your job because you can't justify your budget. And we see these pressures coming from very immediate needs, like our incident responders in the SOC, coming from leadership, but also if you're in a vendor environment, from marketing and from sales. Like, okay, CTI, we pay you the big bucks to go track the adversaries and give them funny names. I need to do this so I can meet my quota, or that we can build the brand and publish a blog that talks about ourselves, or give a talk at a conference like this one, maybe, or probably events like you think your Black Hats or your Troopers, or other events that can disclose information about adversary operations. But the thing is, though, is that deliberately withholding information has consequences. Yes, we want to try to preserve our sources, methods, and analysis, but in doing so, we also don't allow other stakeholders to do their work as effectively as they might have been able to do had we allowed them to operate with this information that we've identified through intelligence functions in front of them. So in looking at that, the impacts of hiding information are that intrusions will take place. Everyone gets compromised. We make fun of people for getting compromised, but everyone gets compromised eventually by someone, or you're compromised right now and you don't know it, which is even worse. As a result, value is lost or impacted, whether that's your network gets encrypted for ransom, you lose intellectual property, that you find a competitor pops up 2 years from now selling the same product, maybe even better than yours or cheaper than yours as a result. But if it ever comes to light that, well, we could have stopped this if only CTI would have told us something, that would be a very awkward conversation to have with your frontline management, with your chief operations officer, with your CISO, with the chief executive officer, or with other leadership. So we have to ask ourselves, how do we balance these competing priorities out? And I think one way is that we can start looking at the disclosure dilemma is not a binary choice of absolutely no or absolutely yes, but rather as a menu of options along a continuum of possibilities between keeping CTI observations secret to preserve sources and methods, and disclosing all information to assist in informed defense. That between these, we can view a variety of options available, that I might be able to disclose some information, but not information that would reveal how that data was collected in the first place. Or I might withhold some information relating to, again, how this was put together or similar, but certainly disclosing just enough so that the defenders can get a feel for what is going on and what action they need to take in order to preserve value in the face of a determined adversary. This requires, however, that we stop and think and ponder just how does this work, how does this line up? And it requires a nuanced understanding of the circumstances that we're operating in and the needs of the audience that we're working with. The CISO doesn't need to know necessarily how the so-called the sausage gets made. No one likes to know how the sausage gets made, but people like to eat the sausage, unless you're a vegetarian, in which case you're dealing with a much less disgustingly made sausage or something. Anyway, enough about sausages. The idea being is that we want to make sure that we are piecing things together that are tailored to our audience in such a fashion that also allow us to maintain continuous collection and analysis from an intelligence function perspective. So key considerations along this is that we need to balance our gain-loss in terms of sensitivity, how unique is the information that is in question, and if lost, could we replace it, whether that's a source or a specific item. Like the APT28 activity, that has never been really effectively replaced, that ability to basically predict infrastructure. Then we have to figure out the impact, that if this intelligence is lost, what does that mean going forward? Or what harm would result if I didn't disclose that? Would this lead to a ransomware event that takes the organization down? Or does this just prolong perhaps the time to live for an adversary that I know I'm going to catch when they start moving laterally in the environment after initial access? And finally, the scope. Is it just me that's involved, or are there other partners that are using this information? And by disclosing in my organization, I threaten potentially other organizations that need this information still? Am I threatening something like a law enforcement or an intelligence agency operation even, and thus causing potential national security or other threats to the wider ecosystem? Things to keep in mind. So our path forward, ideally, is that we identify the criticality and significance of something to figure out just what is simply important. What does my organization need from this information? Determine the value proposition, balancing internal and external perspectives around CTI to see is the value that we add to the organization greater than the value lost by not taking a certain action. Looking at what the outcomes would be between disclosure versus withholding information and trying to go with the choice that brings the most value to your own entity as well as the wider ecosystem of defenders. The result is that ultimately we want to make sure the network is defended, either today in a very immediate sense or setting up continuous information collection and analysis for long-term security and defense and understanding of adversaries. And following this process should allow us in a very case-by-case basis to come up with a way of maybe not resolving the dilemma of disclosure, but at least understanding that a dilemma exists and what are the consequences of not taking this seriously. So conclusions in the remaining time that we have. First and foremost, there are reasons to never disclose sensitive information, I would argue. That includes marketing. We don't disclose just for the clicks. We don't disclose for internet fame and points. I have been involved in organizations that have done that, and they have left organizations as a result of such sort of activities. So we need to be aware that we're not just disclosing to make a name for ourselves, but trying to understand how it is that I'm actually assisting the community of defenders as well as my own organization and keying on that. We don't disclose for sales. We don't, certainly people want to make their quota and so forth, and we need sales to keep our jobs if you're in a vendor environment, but we need to have an intelligent and professional discussion over why we need to do these things so that we're not just taking these actions or revealing information for some sort of public attention and so forth. So in looking at that, we want to try to balance self with wider defense as well. There are actions that defend our organization that may result in harm for other organizations through disclosure. We have to keep those considerations in mind and not ignore them by being dialed into communities, such as the FIRST community, as well as our trust groups and sharing groups, to try to balance out the natural tension that exists in the differing motivations between disclosure for defending my own organization versus withholding that may benefit others that are tracking this activity in parallel. Finally, there are no absolutes. Only a Sith deals in absolutes, right? For any Star Wars fans that are out there, everyone's looking at me like you're such a nerd. But the idea being is that there are no hard rules, that all of these items are really need to be judged on essentially a case-by-case basis. And situational understanding of gain versus loss in given circumstances is not just desirable, but arguably necessary for us to resolve these sorts of dilemmas consistently. And thus understanding consequences and outcomes, either of action or inaction, is critical in making sure that we are putting ourselves in a good position to keep doing our jobs, but also putting defenders in a position where they are able to do theirs, all with the emphasis of preserving value for the organizations that employ us or that we're supporting in a third-party or vendor relationship. As a result, we can look at a hierarchy of needs. That certainly we want to pay attention for organizational self-defense. If we can't defend our own network, we look bad and we end up getting made redundant and have to look for a new job. But we want to expand our understanding beyond just the actions that I'm taking within the perimeter of my own environment and understand that there are consequences for others that are out there too. And what actions I take in my environment to defend my client or my customer or so forth may impact someone else's ability to do the same because I've disclosed something sensitive or interesting that lead to consequences. Ultimately, industry-wide collaboration and coordination becomes a critical aspect of this to ensure that my doing something doesn't impact your ability to do something as well. That we are deconflicting how these items work and the interplay between them to arrive at a state where CTI can continue to function and identify, based upon the conceptual process we talked about earlier, those events where disclosure results in greater value added than value lost based upon the decisions we can support as a result. This is a very quick talk. We weren't able to really go into too much detail, and I kind of got my timing off on the examples. We're going into a break right after this, so please, if you have any questions on this matter, feel free to approach me. I don't bite, and I don't think I smell, but I think we have some time for questions. But before we get, well, we have questions, but there are some resources, especially for the examples. If you'd like to read up on these, feel free to check these links out. I believe these slides will be made available, or if nothing else, I'll put them on SlideShare. And you can contact me, look for me on social media. You can hit up the attack team at attack@miter.org, or again, I'm pretty easy to find and harass if you need to do so. So yes, questions or coffee.